Hollywood once made the whole world tremble with A Quiet Place, where silence became a predator, lurking around every shallow breath, every trembling whisper. But in Vietnam, there is something far older, far more malevolent. A ritual murmured through the dense mountain fog of the Central Highlands, where the veil between the living world and the realm of the dead is as thin and fragile as smoke curling from the hollow heart of an ancient, rotting pine. It is known as the silent presentation. This is not a Hollywood film with thundering sound effects, nor is it some creepy pasta passed around the internet, easily dismissed with the click of a tab. This is something real, something carved into the bones of a forgotten university in Dalat, the city of eternal spring, perched trembling on the edge of the Central Plateau, where the ghosts of French colonizers still haunt crumbling villas, mingling with the wandering spirits of mountain tribes who drift through the deep forests, and where the air is always cold as the breath of the wrongfully dead buried beneath the perpetually damp earth. It has claimed the lives of countless students, leaving lecture halls smeared with warm, fresh blood, the iron stench so thick no mop could ever truly erase it, only leaving yellowish, haunted stains behind. Why silent? Because those who hear it never speak again. Their tongues swell grotesque, their throats packed shut as if stuffed with grave-wet earth, and those who witness it, they dissolve into absolute silence, their final screams swallowed whole by the darkness, leaving behind only shapeless whispers threading through the night wind. My name is Tom, and I live in Saigon, that sweltering, chaotic city where motorcycles scream like a shattered hornet's nest tearing through the air, where the smell of beef pho, bone broth, and star anise mingles with the acrid burn of gasoline from choked, heaving streets. A few months ago, still reeling from the mental exhaustion of college entrance exams, my friends and I decided to head up to Dalat to unwind. We pictured hot coffee by Xuân Hung Lake, slow mountain roads bathed in gentle afternoon light. We had no idea that trip would awaken something hungry for our voices, that it would turn a holiday into a nightmare that still claws at my throat in the dead of night, jolting me awake, drenched in cold sweat, heart pounding like war drums. It all started inside a Highland Coffee on Trung Son Street, in the middle of a torrential downpour that hammered the tin roof like thousands of sharp fingernails scratching and clawing for release from hell below. The air inside reeked of bitter Robusta. We were laughing loudly, talking about the trip like it was nothing more than a light adventure. Flower gardens, hot banh mi on the roadside, cool mountain air to wash away Saigon's sticky heat. But then Dung suddenly looked up. His face darkened, as if a storm cloud had rolled over it, and he said something that silenced the entire table. Our laughter snuffed out like a flame in a cold gust. Have you guys ever heard of the silent presentation? The whole group went dead still. Steam from our iced coffees curled upward like ghostly fingers reaching out from the cups. I knew A Quiet Place. The creatures that hunted by sound, but this was something else entirely. This carried the deep, primal breath of Vietnamese folklore, where people believe in Khoi the realm of wandering souls adrift in eternal fog, and where ancient rituals demand absolute silence, lest the dead claw their way back up from their graves. Dung said he'd read it on a forum called True Ghost Stories, posted by a mysterious account called M.R. Vinch, someone who uploaded grainy, pixelated footage alongside chilling dares. Come see it for yourself. The legend went like this. Years ago, a professor who had lost his mind at Dalat University wrote the presentation in his own blood, dripping from a cut on his wrist, drop by slow drop, right before hanging himself in a lecture hall swallowed in shadow, the rope tightening around his throat with a sound like cracking bone. This was no ordinary lecture. It summoned entities from the most ancient depths of the spirit world, the vengeful ghosts of students who had died in wars long forgotten, now drifting through the living world, demanding their blood debts repaid. Anyone who read it aloud would invite them in. Anyone who merely witnessed it would die horribly or be struck mute forever, their tongues swollen with unutterable horror, their mouth flooded with the taste of copper blood. There had been students who vanished, their bodies later found hanging from the high branches of pine trees, their flesh torn as if raked by invisible claws, their blood spilled into ancient Khmer script upon the earth below, cursed characters from the age of Angkor, carrying an eternal vow of silence. You might think a story like that would scare us off. It didn't. 5 reckless idiots, convinced we were tougher than any ghost, decided to go see it for ourselves, as though we were playing some dangerous game, blissfully ignorant of the price. We took the overnight bus to Dalat, the coach swaying through twisted mountain switchbacks, engine growling beneath a howling wind that moaned past the windows like something alive. The city greeted us with bone-cutting cold and the thick, resinous smell of pine forests, a sound like the distant chanting of tribal shamans woven into every gust. By day, it was beautiful as a dream. Xuanhung Lake glittering gold under a soft sun, its surface shifting like a fairy's breath. Lumveen Square filled with tourists' laughter and the warm scent of grilled rice crackers. We rented motorcycles and tore through winding roads with the cold slapping our faces, laughing and posing in front of gardens blazing with color. But when night fell, the air changed. Slowly, like a nightmare assembling itself piece by piece in the dark, the wind shifted from howling to wailing, long and drawn out, like a child lost deep in a forest. And I began to hear faint murmuring from the silent pine hills, something in archaic Vietnamese, a sound that slid down my spine like ice water, raising the hair on the back of my neck. We found the abandoned school on a forested slope above the city, the place rumored to hold the silent presentation. It was more decrepit than anything our imaginations had conjured. Walls blanketed in slick green mold, damp as rotting flesh. Windows shattered into jagged teeth. Grinning and sneering like the maw of some enormous demon. Wind forcing itself through every crack and crevice, moaning low and hollow like the last breath of something long dead. Scrawled across the walls in dripping red, the deep, dark red of old blood, were words. Welcome to University X, where students never leave. Stay silent. Close your eyes, unless you want to die. Run, before things get so much worse. The words tightened something in my chest. The smell of that red ink, metallic, sharp, rose into my nostrils like the smell of something genuinely bleeding. We slipped inside at midnight. Flashlight beams swept the corridors, darkness that pressed back like the inside of a tomb. A smell hit us immediately, not merely mildew, but decomposition, the sweetly rotten stench of a decaying body, fused with the cold, dead smell of incense ash, as if a secret funeral had just concluded in the blackness. My stomach turned. Trang gripped my hand tight enough to hurt, her voice barely holding together. Why do I feel like something is watching us? Like there are hundreds of eyes in that darkness right now. We crept through that blackness for over half an hour, our footsteps echoing like knuckles rapping on a coffin lid, every footfall creaking through rotted floorboards. Eventually, we reached the old library. The air there was heavier still, old paper, mildew, layers of undisturbed dust coating every shelf like cobwebs made of decades. After rummaging through the dark, my hand closed around a bundle of yellowed pages, edges torn and ragged, the handwriting twisting and clotting like dried blood. And still, faintly, unmistakably, carrying the smell of iron. My heart slammed against my ribs. There it was. I had barely begun to open it when Dung moved, wrenching the papers from my grip with strange, sudden strength. His face was different in that moment. Skin the color of old wax. Eyes ringed with shadows deep as bruises, as if he hadn't slept in weeks. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something thick and wet, rasping up from somewhere far below us. "Thank you, all of you. I've been looking for this." The group froze. The air seemed to solidify around us. I thought he was joking, took one step toward him, and then Huai screamed, voice cracking like a shattered plate. "Dung is possessed. Don't get near him." Possessed. I stood paralyzed, blood gone cold. I had always believed possession was a thing for horror films. But Huai kept talking, face drained white as bone. I noticed something was wrong with him since we came in. His face went dark. His eyes. Right outside the library door, I heard him whispering, "Almost here now." Like he was calling something toward us. Before the last word left Huai's mouth, the air inside the library moved, a violent, invisible gust that swept dust and old papers into the air, pages flipping backward, as if read by unseen hands. Dung raised his head. His eyes were black, not dark brown, black. The pupils swallowed wide and endless as the throat of a well. When he spoke again, it wasn't one voice. It was dozens overlapping, grating, buzzing through the air like a failing radio signal. "Little ones, enjoy the fear. You're too afraid to scream." He placed the papers on the rotting podium and spread his arms wide as if embracing the darkness. His lips kept moving, but no sound came out. And it was that silence, the moving mouth, the stolen voice that ran ice through my marrow. No wind, no labored breathing, not even the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. Only a silence so dense it had physical weight, an invisible hand closing around my chest, the air thickening to something you could choke on. Then another sound broke through that dead quiet, the measured click of leather shoes on wood, slow, deliberate, heavy as the footsteps of death itself. From the far end of the darkened hall, figures emerged, students wearing old, rotted graduation gowns, cloth hanging in blackened strips, smelling of decay and dried blood. Their faces were grotesque, wrong eyes sunken into black pits with no end, mouths sewn shut with thick black thread, dark blood still weeping from each crude stitch. They moved in perfect silence. Every one of them was staring directly at us, their gaze hollow and ravenous, as though they intended to consume something that lived behind our eyes. Zong threw his head back and laughed. A broken, warping sound that careened off every wall, like an echo from the bottom of the earth. "My students, make them silent forever." The figures advanced, slow, unrelenting, their footsteps building like a drumbeat, quickening towards something terrible. We were driven back against the wall, spines pressed against concrete, gone cold as a slab, Trang sobbing openly, her hot tears falling on my hand. "What do we do? Are we going to die here?" Huai didn't answer. He screamed, a single raw sound, and threw himself at Dung, lunging for the papers. Dung swung. His fingernails had grown unnaturally long, black and sharp as demons' claws, and they drove into Huai's stomach with a wet, horrible thud. Bright blood sprayed out, hot, the smell of it filling the room instantly. Huai slumped but kept screaming, voice failing but defiant. "Run! Don't you dare waste this, run!" I grabbed Trang and Lin, and we ran down the hall, feet sliding on floorboards slick with blood, footsteps thundering behind us, not one pair, but thousands, as if the entire school was waking up. The walls themselves groaning like bones rising from graves. The air grew heavier with every stride. blood and cold incense filling my lungs until my vision blurred. Near the exit, something blocked our path. A figure impossibly tall, its crown pressed against the ceiling, wearing a tattered graduation robe thick with grave dust. Where its head should have been, nothing. Only an open throat, a yawning black cavity, the wind drawn into it with a low, unending moan, like a voice calling up from hell. It turned toward us. The smell of rot hit me like a fist. I shoved Lin and Trang behind me, stepped forward, and screamed. And then everything went dark. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came back, I was in a hospital bed in Dalat, the sharp chemical bite of antiseptic rising into my nose, my entire body aching as if I'd been fed through a machine. Lin and Trang were mostly unharmed, cuts and bruises. I had a long gash across my stomach, blood soaking through the bandage, requiring 12 stitches, each needle pulling through the skin, a small reminder of everything I couldn't outrun. Trang sat at my bedside, face the white of blank paper, hands trembling as they gripped mine. I asked, voice raw and barely functional, "Where are Huai and Dung?" Trang didn't answer. She only shook her head, tears falling silently down her face, as if to speak their names aloud was to invite something terrible back in, as if the silence that had taken them was still listening. 2 days later, we left Dalat on a swaying night bus, the cold wind still moaning outside the glass, like a parting threat. Huai and Dung had not been found, swallowed, it seemed, by whatever darkness lived in the walls of that school. And the silent presentation had vanished with them, gone as if it had never existed, leaving behind only the memory of yellowed pages and a smell of old iron I couldn't wash from the back of my throat. Back in Saigon, I couldn't sleep. Every night, I lay on my damp mattress, soaked in cold sweat, staring at a ceiling that seemed to press lower by the hour. For nearly a week now, at exactly 3 a.m., I hear it. Leather shoes on the floor of my apartment hallway, slow, even, measured as a dying heart. I check. Nothing is ever there, only darkness pooling thick in the corridor, and then the sound of pages turning softly, deliberately, as if someone is preparing to resume a lecture that was never finished. The paper whispers, like skin being peeled back. Then, one night, 3 a.m., of course, there was a knock at my door. Slow, even, cold, as a fist rapping on a coffin lid. I held my breath. Cold sweat traced lines down my face. I pressed my eye to the peephole. A man stood in the corridor, tall, wearing a black vest that caught the dim light like polished obsidian, a wide-brimmed hat casting the upper half of his face in deep shadow, and beneath that shadow, a grin. Yellow teeth, crooked and knowing, the smile of something that has been patient for a very long time. He held up a bundle of papers, old, their edges torn to rags, stained with dark reddish-brown blotches that still, somehow, smelled faintly of iron. His voice came through the door, low and thick, buzzing with static, as if transmitted from somewhere that has no name. "I've come to return what you left behind."